Hi everyone, this is lecture 17. We're going to continue our discussion on the endocrine system. But today we're going to cover primarily the interaction between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And we'll finish off with talking about the adrenal gland, which we talked briefly about when we talked about the sympathetic nervous system. So pretty much these lectures will cover both the anatomical and physiological relationships of these endocrine glands. Here, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland and the adrenal gland. So make sure you know the basic structures and their function and the names of the hormones and what they do. So let's start with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is a small collection of nuclei that has many functions. And in part of the endocrine system, it works closely with the pituitary gland, as we will see. So here's some of the functions of the hypothalamus. It's important in regulation of hunger, thirst, fluid balance, body temperature. It influences our sleep-wake cycle, and it even has some certain reproductive functions. So the hypothalamus has many diverse functions for the human body. Now, some of the neurons secreting hormones affect the posterior pituitary, while others target the anterior pituitary. And these hormones from both may directly control certain body functions, while others are called tropic hormones that actually control the secretion of other endocrine glands. So a tropic hormone is where you have a hormone produced from one endocrine gland that affects the secretion of hormones from another endocrine gland. And these are called tropic hormones. So let's look at the structure of the hypothalamus and the pituitary. As you will see, or as you already know from the lab, that there's a close anatomical relationship between the two structures. The hypothalamus is a small portion of the diencephalon, and the pituitary is a small organ located in the sella turcica. So you remember in SCB 203, you learned about the sphenoid bone, and one area of the sphenoid bone was this little depression called the sella turcica. That depression is what protects the pituitary gland. So here in this kind of very simple structure, we see the pituitary gland, and you can see there's an anterior and there's a posterior pituitary gland, and it's connected by a structure called the infundibulum to the hypothalamus, which is on the other side here of the diencephalon. Now, the pituitary gland, as we mentioned, has two portions. There's an anterior pituitary called the adrenal hypophysis, and the posterior pituitary called the neural hypophysis. So if you have trouble remembering them, they're in alphabetical order. So in this diagram that shows a large picture of the pituitary, here we see the anterior pituitary or adrenal hypophysis and the posterior pituitary or the neural hypophysis. Now, the close relationship between the hypothalamic and the pituitary is not by coincidence. They are connected by the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. Now, you remember portal systems from SCB 203, namely the hepatic portal system, where a vein called hepatic portal vein connected the capillaries from the digestive organs to the capillaries of the liver. Here, the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system, there is a vein, a portal vein that connects the capillaries of the hypothalamus to the capillaries of the pituitary gland. So this forces hormones from the hypothalamus to go to the pituitary gland to have effects on it. So here's a kind of a brief picture showing. Here's the hypothalamic neurons, and when they secrete hormones, they have no choice but go through the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system directly to the pituitary to have its effects there. And then, of course, the pituitary gland will respond by secreting its own hormones. So let's first look at the hormones of the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. Okay. These include the antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, which are produced by the hypothalamus, but they're stored in the posterior pituitary. So again, they're produced by the hypothalamus and they're stored in the posterior pituitary. So let's talk about the antidiuretic hormone first, or ADH. It's also known as vasopressin because its influence on blood pressure. Now, the diuresis is the removal of water from the body. So an antidiuretic allows you to maintain water, and so its specific function is in water balance. And again, as we mentioned, they're made in the hypothalamic neurons, and they travel through the infundibulum to the hypophyseal from the hypothalamus through the infundibulum to the posterior pituitary. Okay, and then they're secreted when the hypothalamic neurons fire action potentials. Okay, so this is called, remember, this is also called a neural hypothesis. So it's more like a traditional neural interaction where the hypothalamus is signaling the posterior pituitary to secrete these hormones. What does antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin do? Well, as we mentioned, it increases water retention in the kidneys. They do this by increasing water channels called aquaporins in the kidney tubules. And as a result, water moves into extracellular fluid by osmosis. So here's just a brief, simple picture of a kidney tubule. Increase in fluid will be osmotically absorbed by the kidney cells and into the interstitial fluid. So more water is retained. More water retained, then there's less water being excreted in the urine. Okay, so how does it work? Well, an increase in solute concentrations is detected by osmolar receptors in the hypothalamus. This stimulates antidiuretic hormone released from the posterior pituitary, and this leads to water retention by the mechanisms we showed before. And the result, there's a decrease in solute concentrations in the blood. Okay. Now, the same osmolar receptors respond to low solute concentrations by inhibiting ADH release. And the result, this leads to more water loss and an increase in blood solute concentration. So by increasing or decreasing antidiuretic hormone, we can either decrease solute concentration or increase solute concentration. There's a disorder called diabetes insipidus, and this is due to the lack of ADH. And as you might expect, the symptoms include thirst and dehydration, since the body is unable to conserve water. The other hormone is oxytocin. And oxytocin you've heard of from SCB 203. One of its functions is to support reproduction and milk release. Okay, and again, it's produced by the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, similarly to that of antidiuretic hormone. Functions of oxytocin include the letdown reflex for milk ejection, okay, in the mammary glands, contraction of uterine smooth muscles during labor. This is probably the one that you probably heard or learned about in SCB 203. And it's also important for emotional bonding in both sexes, as well as from mother and child. Now, it gets a little more complicated when we talk about the anterior pituitary hormone, because it's under negative feedback control. And this negative feedback control of these anterior pituitary hormones is at the level of the hypothalamus, at the level of the anterior pituitary, as well as at the target cell hormones. So many of these have 3 levels of negative feedback. And so each tier includes a stimulus, a receptor, a control center, and either a response or an effector. As we learned in SCB 203, well, negative feedback mechanisms. Okay, so here in this table showing you the first tier control at the level of hypothalamus, second tier control at the level of the anterior pituitary, third tier control is at the target organs, and then we have the effects from these hormones. And we're going to we'll discuss each of these hormones and how their negative feedback mechanisms back to the pituitary and hypothalamus. So let's look at the first tier control. The first tier control involves the hypothalamus, which secretes releasing and inhibiting hormones. Okay, so this first tier control, we have releasing hormones that will stimulate the pituitary to release its hormones. There may be also inhibitory hormones that prevents the release of the hormones from the pituitary gland. The second tier control are the hormones that stimulate or inhibit hormone production of the anterior pituitary gland. Okay. That's at this level here. Third tier control involves pituitary hormones that stimulate cells of target organs. Okay, so the third tier control are the hormones that secrete hormones to the target organs. Finally, we have the target organ that affects some homeostatic variable. Okay, and then these may have negative feedback mechanisms back to the anterior pituitary as well as the hypothalamus. Okay, so decreased secretion of releasing hormones from the hypothalamus or increasing inhibiting hormones may occur at the level of hypothalamus, and these results in a decreased secretion from the anterior pituitary gland. So in both cases, decreased releasing hormones or an increase in inhibiting hormones will cause a decrease in secretion from the anterior pituitary gland. And so we can see this negative feedback here. The pituitary hormones themselves affect other glands. As we mentioned, these are called tropic hormones, where hormones of one endocrine gland affect the secretion of other endocrine glands. And here are some examples of pituitary hormones that affect other glands. We have thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, Adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, Prolactin, Luteinizing hormone, Follicle-Stimulating Hormone, and growth hormone. So we'll talk a little bit about each one. So TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, also called thyrotropin, as you might expect, it stimulates the development of the thyroid gland and secretes and secretion of thyroid hormones. And it is stimulated by the hypothalamic thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH. Okay, so notice the abbreviation is TRH, which is thyrotropin releasing hormone, which will stimulate thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. Okay, so it's stimulated by TRH, but it's inhibited by somatostatin. Okay, so here's thyrotropin releasing hormone that will stimulate thyroid stimulating hormone that will affect the thyroid and stimulate the secretion of thyroid hormones. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, it's produced by these corticotropic cells for the development of the adrenal glands and synthesis of steroid hormones. And it is stimulated by the hypothalamus by hypothalamic corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH. So CRH from the hypothalamus will stimulate ACTH from the anterior pituitary gland. So here is corticotropic releasing hormone, which will stimulate ACTH that affects the adrenal cortex, that has effects on different hormones such as glucocorticoids or steroids, which we'll talk about later today. Prolactin stimulates the growth of mammary glands and initiates and maintenance milk production. Okay, and it's stimulated by the hypothalamic hormone prolactin releasing hormone, PRH. However, it's inhibited by a prolactin inhibiting factor, now known to be called dopamine. Okay, so here's prolactin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. It stimulates prolactin from the anterior pituitary that has effects on mammary glands. And this is one of the exceptions to this table, because this one is not a tropic hormone, and there's no other hormones being produced from the mammary glands. Luteinizing hormone, LH. This is stimulated by the gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH. In males, luteinizing hormone stimulates testosterone in the testes, the male reproductive organ. In females, luteinizing hormone stimulates estrogens and progesterone, and also triggers ovulations, which we'll discuss more later in the semester. And these are more the what we consider the female reproductive hormones. Now, follicle-stimulating hormone from the hypothalamus will stimulate the gonadotropin release. Follicle-stimulating hormone is stimulated by gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Okay. So in males, FSH stimulates testes to produce chemicals that bind and concentrate testosterone. In females, FSH works with LH to trigger production of estrogens and also maturation of ovarian follicles, which houses developing oocytes. So here we have gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, which stimulates FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary, and these will have effects on the male and female reproductive organs, and which also secrete their hormones such as testosterone and estrogens. Finally, growth hormone is also produced by the anterior pituitary gland, and growth hormone has widespread effects over the entire body. You know, it's periodically released during the day, but its peak secretions occur during sleep. As you might expect, growth hormone regulates and controls all types of growth. That includes targeting skeletal, cardiac muscle, adipose, liver, cartilage, and bone. And the effects can be short or long term. Okay, and so the short-term effects are primarily metabolic in nature, such as lipolysis, gluconeogenesis, which we'll talk about later in the semester, and inhibition of glucose uptake by muscle. So these increases glucose and fatty acids in blood, which promotes growth. Okay, so here are the short-term effects. Long-term effects are not all directly mediated by growth hormone, because sometimes they act on other tissues, such as liver and other tissues. They produce hormones called insulin-like growth factors, which has effects on nearly every cell type in the body. So some examples of insulin-like growth factor are increased protein synthesis and cell division, increased bone and muscle development in children, regulation of body mass, and decreased blood glucose by stimulating glucose uptake by cells. And so here are the long-term effects on glucose, bone, and muscle. Now, how is it regulated? It's stimulated by growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. And so it increases during exercise, fasting, and stress. And it's inhibited by somatostatin. So somatostatin has multiple inhibitory effects. Okay, so again, growth hormone is stimulated by growth hormone releasing hormone. It's inhibited by somatostatin. It has effects on liver, muscle, bone, and fat, and which they will produce other effects by insulin-like growth factor. There are also growth hormone disorders, and most of these result in growth disruptions. So, for example, if it's hypersecretion results in gigantism before closure of the epiphyseal plates, because they'll continue to grow. Hypersecretion results in a disorder called acromegaly after the closure the epiphyseal plates where the bones get wider, and hyposecretion results prior to the closure of epiphyseal plates results in dwarfism. So they can have growth hormone can have extreme effects. Okay, so look at the hypothalamic hormones, and here's a table summarizing all the hypothalamic hormones that we discussed. Finally, we're going to now go to the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands produces steroid hormones and catecholamines. Okay, remember, the adrenal glands, it sits like a little hat on top of the kidneys. And the adrenal gland is composed of an inner adrenal medulla and an outer adrenal cortex. Okay, and this is here, I've indicated, labeled here, each one. And the adrenal cortex has three distinct zones. It has an outer zona glomerulosa, a middle zona fasciculata, and an inner zona reticularis. Okay. So here in this figure is showing you the different layers, zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. And you can, by the histology, you can see the different way they appear distinctly as different layers. So look at the hormones of the adrenal cortex. Each zone produces steroid hormones. Okay, so the zona glomerulosa produces a group of hormones called mineralocorticoids, whereas the zona fasciculata and zona reticularis produces glucocorticoids and a group called adrenergic steroids. Okay, so here I've made a little table for you showing the different layers: zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. Okay, and it shows the outer, middle, inner layers, and it shows that they're distinctly different histologically. But the zona glomerulosa produces mineralocorticoids, whereas the zona fasciculata and zona reticularis produces glucocorticoids and adrenergic steroids. The mineralocorticoids, as you might expect from the name, they are important for fluid and electrolyte homeostasis. And the main hormone is called aldosterone. Okay. So what are the functions of aldosterone? One of the functions is to maintain the extracellular sodium and potassium concentrations. They regulate extracellular fluid volume. And they also maintain blood pressure and acid-base homeostasis. So they play very important roles for aldosterone. So how is synthesis regulated? Well, it's regulated by different factors such as angiotensin II, which you learned in SCB 203, elevated potassium concentrations, or a decrease in blood pH. So this is how the different factors can influence the functions of aldosterone. Okay. How is it regulated? Well, it increases by corticosteroid releasing hormone and adrenocorticotropic hormone. Okay. Hyperaldosteronism can lead to hypokalemia, increase in potassium, hypernatremia, increase in sodium, and hypertension. So this is why kalemia is potassium, because that's how the abbreviation is K, and this is sodium. That's where we get the abbreviation Na. It may also disrupt acid-base balance and alkalinity of blood pH. So let's look at the glucocorticoids and their effect on metabolic homeostasis. And glucocorticoids are important in mediating the body's response to stress. Okay, and probably the most potent glucocorticoid is one called cortisol, also known as hydrocortisol. Here are some of the effects of cortisol. Gluconeogenesis, this means the ability to produce new glucose from the liver. Release of amino acids from muscle tissue, and release of fatty acids from adipose tissue. Okay, so here are these functions here of glucocorticoids. Other effects of cortisol, facts. Most tissues have cortisol receptors, making it its potent effects. It's an important anti-inflammatory agent. It suppresses the immune response. And it's an important component in the stress response. How is it regulated? Cortisol is controlled by the hypophyseal pituitary adrenal cortical or HPA axis. Okay, so daily cortisol releasing hormone secretion in the hypothalamus, especially in the early morning hours. CRH is influenced by the cerebral cortex response to stressors, and also the sympathetic nervous system. So we have these three factors here that may stimulate CRH release. CRH stimulates adrenocorticotropic hormone release from the anterior pituitary gland, and this stimulates cortisol production and release from the zona fasciculata. Now, cortisol itself, as it's elevated, suppresses secretion of CRH and ACTH. So we see here in this figure that cortisol can negative feedback to the level of the anterior pituitary gland, and also negative feedback to the hypothalamus. There are several cortisol disorders too, such as Cushing's disease, iatrogenic Cushing syndrome, and Addison disease. Cushing's disease is oversecretion due to a tumor. Iatrogenic Cushing syndrome is induced by the doctor and may be due to long-term administration of corticosteroids. So sort of essentially artificial oversecretion. And the symptoms include fat deposits, a very round face or moon face, muscle wasting, hyperglycemia and elevated blood sugar, increased blood pressure, increased appetite, which will increase weight gain, osteoporosis, so the breakdown of bone, and immunosuppression. So this picture shows an individual before the development of Cushing syndrome and then after Cushing syndrome, and you can see the increase in weight gain and also the characteristic moon face. So Cushing's disease is treated by removing a tumor that may cause the hypersecretion. Now, how do you treat iatrogenic Cushing syndrome? Well, it can be reversed if the corticosteroid therapy is decreased or stopped. Addison's disease is hyposecretion of cortisol and aldosterone. So there's a decrease in the secretion of these hormones. So due to it could be due to adrenal gland abnormalities, enzyme deficiencies, or adrenal destruction. And so a patient is at risk of altered fluid, electrolyte, and acid-base homeostasis. Okay. Now, what about the hormones of the adrenal medulla? Well, we talked about this briefly already when we talked about the sympathetic nervous system. We said the adrenal medulla was like a giant ganglion that's stimulated by the presynaptic preganglionic neuron, and it secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine. And as we said, it stimulated the preganglionic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system, and it's regulated by the sympathetic nervous system and ACTH. And so here is the final table showing the hormones of the adrenal gland that we just discussed.